Hello and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking about Final Fantasy III and my experiences playing it as part of my year-long challenge to play as many of the Final Fantasy games as I can reasonably do in this year of 2020. And if you're watching this does indicate that I in fact have beat 3 of them so far. So with that being said, we're going to get into it. So just to refresh your memory, if you haven't watched the other videos, the plan is to play as many of the main series Final Fantasy games as I can in 2020. There's 13 games, about 12 months, and we're going to see as far as I can get. For reminders, I've played some of these to completion, some of them not, some more than others, but this is sort of where we're starting out. So we're going to talk about Final Fantasy III today. So, Final Fantasy III was a game that I believe I'd started before this year, before I picked it up again. And the only reason I think I know that is because I think I must have had the DS remake cartridge at some point. I might have gotten it from a GameFly or something like that, if that tells you how old I am. And I think that probably what would happen was I'd got it, I'd maybe started it for a few minutes and never been able to play much more than that, and then probably just moved on to it, hey, I'll finish this someday, and never actually did, is I think what probably happened. But I was going into Final Fantasy III, knowing a little about it. I knew that the job system was in it, because I know the Onion Knight sort of thing from playing Dissidia and playing other games. I knew a little bit about it, but not much. And I was hopeful. I was looking forward to it. I thought it would be cool because I knew the job system existed. The job system in other Final Fantasy games has been something I really, really love. So I was really hoping that Final Fantasy III would be like the beginning of that, and it would be something super interesting to get into. So I went into it with some pretty cool hopes, and as a reminder, I was playing the version on Steam, which, as far as I'm aware, is a port of the DS sort of remaster situation. So it has the improved graphics, cutscenes, some modern features, and all of that. So I didn't play the original, unfortunately. So when playing Final Fantasy III, I completed the game in about 17 hours. It was a little bit longer than that, but that was, including some downtime, so it was roughly 17 hours. And I had about 10 full party game overs. And this usually, for me, happened on bosses, as opposed to something like Final Fantasy II, where I was just wiping on random stuff because I didn't care. Most of the time in 3, I wiped on a boss, which is something I'll talk about later because that's something that impacted my enjoyment of the game. But 10 hours, or 17 hours, around 10 game overs. So let's talk about what I liked about Final Fantasy III. So I really liked the story of Final Fantasy III. It was kind of simplistic. It's these 4 people, they get together and they have to save the crystals. And it's a very Final Fantasy story, which is funny because having played 1 and 2, in some ways this is the most Final Fantasy story of all of the Final Fantasies. At least the Final Fantasy series as it continues on from this point. So I thought that was really cool. I really enjoyed it. It was simplistic. It wasn't super interesting and mind-blowing, but there were some cool moments. I liked the idea that you get the airship fairly early on, and I loved the idea of the different worlds and different things going on. I really liked that in the game. And not to go into too much with spoilers, but it's a cool story for the most part. I also found myself really enjoying the modern features of the game. And of course that's obvious because I was playing the remaster, so it has things like auto battle, and it has, some other things that are improved potentially because they are on the PC release or were originally in the DS remaster. But I liked those things. So auto battle was really good and useful for this because there's a lot of times where you're just grinding, or a lot of times where you're going through content that isn't super interesting. So in my case, for example, there were a few times where I wiped on a boss and I had to go through the entire dungeon again, and auto battle was really nice for that. So I didn't have to think about it too much. Also, it was nice for grinding and nice for gaining levels and all of that kind of stuff. I also like the idea of the job system. So I mentioned this earlier, but the job system in other Final Fantasy games has been something that I've really, really enjoyed. So Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Advance, especially Advance, are some of my favorite games of all time. And I really loved the job systems and the idea that if you think about it carefully, if you build them carefully enough, you can make a really cool roster of very powerful characters that are all unique from each other. And I was really hoping that Final Fantasy III would give me that experience. And in some ways it did, in some ways it didn't. So one of the things that was very nice about this was the idea of the job system. There was a bunch of jobs out there you could change basically at any time. And some characters were better at some things than others, and you could build a diverse party out of that. And I did enjoy that. I did early on really enjoy being able to mess around with characters, try different builds, build things that worked for me. I will talk a little bit later about sort of the functionality of how this worked out, but the idea of the job system was super cool, and I really enjoyed it. So let's talk about what I didn't like here. So this is actually going to be shorter, thankfully, than my Final Fantasy II video, but I mentioned this a few times. I did not enjoy the dungeon system in this game. So in Final Fantasy III, you cannot save in dungeons, which I get. You're trying to make the game a little bit more difficult. You're trying to make people prepare for the bosses a little bit better. And, I understand that piece. So you end up saving right before you go into the dungeon. You get all the way through, hope you can beat the boss. And the dungeons, to be fair, aren't all that long. They're about, 20, 30 minutes each, so it's not a huge deal. But I really didn't like it because I probably early on wiped probably 6 of my 10 times on bosses. And so I would get to the end of the dungeon, have stomped my way through all of the minions to get there, and then just get beaten randomly by the boss. And it was a huge pain. And I really didn't like that. It made me repeat a bunch of the dungeons. And eventually, in order to avoid wiping, what I ended up doing was just grinding and spending way too much time on it because I didn't want to go back and redo old content if I wiped. And that took away my enjoyment of the game, for sure. I will say that. This goes hand in hand with the dungeon system, but the bosses. A lot of the bosses are really weird power spikes from the dungeons they're in. So you can waltz your way through the dungeon and then get stomped by the boss. And that sucks, because it's like, okay, this doesn't feel like it has any relationship to each other, and that's not really fun. So that's the thing I didn't like. Also, some of the bosses just aren't really interesting or have stupid gimmicks that are just not super fun. And this is a staple I'm now finding out in almost all the Final Fantasy games, but there's a boss not that far into the game that constantly changes his elemental weakness, and it just artificially lengthens a boss fight that isn't fun and isn't super interesting, and it makes you use sort of job combinations that really aren't interesting or fun, and so that sort of impacted my enjoyment, right? Some of the later bosses, once I started actually spending a lot of time trying to get ready to fight them, weren't as bad, and I enjoyed them a little bit more. But oftentimes bosses were just big nuisances more than they were interesting challenges, because I would get wiped by something unlucky or something stupid and then have to go back and redo it, and it just wasn't fun for me. And then my last piece here is the actual jobs themselves. So I think the big missing piece for me here is that it didn't feel a lot like the jobs that you use mattered over time. That you weren't building character builds, you were just having characters as certain jobs throughout the game. And I get what they're going for, that you're kind of constantly moving between jobs and having different skills, but it just wasn't that fun for me. Especially because you get into this situation where a lot of the jobs in the game are actually not good, or at least they're marginally good, and I spent a lot of time wishing I could have just started with the basic jobs and have warrior and black mage and white mage and thief or something, and just stay that way the whole game. And that was a frustration, because I almost wish I would have just done that and not played the game with all these extra jobs. And it's not entirely the game's fault, but things like, oh, okay, you have scholar. It doesn't really do a whole lot magically. It has one ability where you get to scout enemies, and it's not super interesting. You use it for one boss fight and it's not cool. Or bard, where this, before you get certain spells, they're really not good, and if bard is your only support, you end up wasting all this time, and they're very inefficient, and it's just, again, a lot of the jobs were not fun, and a lot of them just didn't really seem like they did anything. Viking was oh, you can use hammers and they hit really hard. Okay, that's great, but why do I care, And the thing was, a lot of the simpler jobs were the better ones. So knight and black mage and white mage and things like that were jobs I enjoyed. And I would have stuck with them if it wasn't this ascending power curve. The other thing that was a problem in the game is that a lot of the jobs build upon each other. And so there are some jobs that are basically the same as the previous job. They're just slightly stronger. And I get that, but it's not a promotion. It's just like a totally different job that doesn't make any sense. So I didn't enjoy that part too much. So with that being said, let's talk about the surprising pieces. What jumped out at me in this game? So I will say the cool part about this was being able to see series staples for the first time. So as someone who's played the games for a very long time, things like moogles and crystals and saving the world from some bad guy destroying the crystals and channeling power from these things, those are really cool. And those are staples in a lot of the later games. And Final Fantasy III is the first to use a lot of those first big things like chocobos and airships and, all of that kind of stuff. And some of those existed in the previous games, but this is really the first time where a lot of them get used to a really big extent. And that was something I really enjoyed. I loved it. I also really enjoyed the weird novelty of the game. So in some of the jobs, they're totally useless, right? But at least they're interesting. And some of them are like, oh, you play around with this and see what you can do. Like, there's some weird places in the game where, you get shrunk down, and so you can't use physical jobs. You need to use magic jobs. And that was really cool. It's kind of a gimmick and kind of stupid, but it was fun. It was interesting. You had to mix things up in response to the game. And I like that the game encouraged you to do these kind of novelty-based things. Here's a boss battle who you can solve very easily using one job's ability. Use that job. And there's also a boss fight in the game that in some ways encourages you to use all 4 of the same job. There's a boss fight that you can win really easily by doing 4 dragoons, which I thought was super cool. And the game gives you gear for things and does weird things to let you play around with these. I thought that was fun. It's weird novelties, but it is good. And this goes along with it, but it promotes fun in a lot of ways. It says, hey, try out the jobs, see what you like. The game allows you to mess with things and use different spells for different people and shift things around. And I thought that the game did a mostly good job of promoting fun. Now, I didn't say I always had fun, but it did a good job of trying to promote the idea of fun, which is important to me. So let's talk about the verdict for this game. So I will say Final Fantasy III was not my favorite Final Fantasy. Based on the games I've played so far in the year, I would probably put it at 3rd. It was better than Final Fantasy II, certainly. It was still kind of annoying by the end of it in that same kind of way. So I will say that it wasn't my favorite. Having played the other Final Fantasy games, I would say it's pretty in the middle of my experience. Wasn't terrible. It trends maybe towards the lower end, but that's not necessarily because it's a bad game. Maybe there's just a lot better games or games that fit better for me. And I will say part of my verdict on this is that the game just has a lot of near misses. There's a lot of things that, like the job system. If more of the jobs were interesting or better or more powerful, if designing characters was more interesting, I would have really loved the game. I would have been obsessed with it. If there were different ways to obtain power for your characters, that would be really cool. Because one thing I thought about was in games like Tactics Advance, you could send characters on missions and you get bonuses for completing things. And that helps you grow your characters in a more fast, paced kind of way. And Final Fantasy III doesn't have those things, right? It's just like go out, grind, change jobs, see what happens. So in a lot of ways, the story for me of Final Fantasy III is a game that has a lot of potential. I actually think if you remixed some of the things around and were maybe less faithful to the original material, I think you could produce something that was really, really cool. Obviously, I played the remake, which I'm assuming the intent was to keep it sort of close to the original. So, I think in some ways for me, that made the game less likable. In some of the, potential things like, oh, this would be really cool if you spent time in it, but I realistically wasn't going to spend that time, right? So like the Onion Knight job is a novelty. There's like quests and things that are cool, but you don't need to do them, and a lot of times they don't pay off. So like I did the quest to get Onion Knight, but I was never going to play the game long enough to actually level my characters for Onion Knight to be a good investment. And that's a shame because, I didn't feel motivated to do a lot of the things. And, if it was remixed slightly, maybe I would have. So, just near misses, right? So that is my verdict. That is my experience of playing Final Fantasy 3. So with all that being said, I'm curious to hear, if Final Fantasy 3 is your favorite game, why? What am I missing? What could I do differently if I were to play it again? All that kind of stuff. But with all that being said, I will talk to you in the comments, and I will see you next time when we talk about Final Fantasy 4.